In 1883, two sisters in Yorkshire made a pact that would stain their family name for generations. They were inseparable, Elizabeth and Clara Whitby, beautiful, educated, and bound by a bond stronger than marriage. Until they decided to test that theory. Each envied what the other had, a husband, a home, a life. So one summer night they made an arrangement to exchange it all. Husbands, rings, and names. What began as a secret indulgence soon descended into madness, betrayal, and death. Because when the first grave was dug, it was empty, and when the second was filled, no one could be sure which sister lay inside. The Whitby sisters were born into privilege, yet their home was far from peaceful. Their father, a respected tradesman in Yorkshire, was stern and devout, obsessed with propriety and appearances. Their mother, by contrast, was delicate and withdrawn, a woman whose eyes seemed to linger always on something distant, something only she could see. It was said that when Elizabeth was born, her mother whispered, "She will never be alone." 3 years later, Clara arrived, and that prophecy seemed fulfilled. The sisters were inseparable from their first breath. Elizabeth, the calm one who planned every detail, and Clara, the dreamer who followed her lead without question. They shared everything, their toys, their tutors, even their secrets. When one caught a fever, the other refused to leave her bedside. When one cried, the other wept. Their bond was so consuming that even their parents began to worry. Visitors often commented that the girls seemed more like mirrored halves than siblings. They spoke in echoes, recalled the family's maid. If you asked Elizabeth a question, Clara would answer it. In time, the sisters began dressing alike, copying each other's handwriting, and even finishing each other's sentences. What seemed charming in childhood would later become the seed of something much darker. As they grew older, the lines between them blurred further. Elizabeth, with her dark hair and composed demeanor, carried herself like the lady she was raised to be. She read philosophy, managed the household accounts, and learned to keep her emotions buried. Clara, on the other hand, had a softness about her that drew people in, particularly men. She played the piano, wrote poetry, and could make anyone feel seen if only for a moment. Yet beneath that charm was a quiet envy. Clara adored her sister, but she also longed to be her, to possess her self-assurance, her grace, the silent power she held in every room. When their father died suddenly in 1879, that balance shifted. Elizabeth took charge of the family affairs while Clara struggled to find her place. Neighbors whispered that Clara had begun mimicking her sister more intensely than ever, imitating her gestures, her speech, even her signature. Elizabeth tolerated it at first, perhaps even found comfort in it. But there were moments when her patience cracked. "You are not me, Clara," she was heard saying one evening, her voice trembling with something between anger and fear. Still, no matter how strained their relationship became, neither could bear to be apart. They attended the same church, the same social gatherings, and even turned down suitors until they could both be married. It was Elizabeth who married first, a match arranged to secure the family's dwindling fortune. Clara followed soon after, determined not to be left behind. But though they now lived in separate homes, their connection only deepened. Letters passed between them daily, each one laced with affection and resentment in equal measure. By the early 1880s, the Whitby sisters had become local curiosities, two women so bound together that even marriage couldn't separate them. Yet behind their polite smiles lay a dangerous truth. Neither could truly exist without the other. And when that dependency began to crack, something unholy started to take its place. Elizabeth's marriage to Thomas Ellery was, from the beginning, a transaction more than a union of hearts. He was a banker of rigid manner and predictable routine, a man whose world was made of ledgers, numbers, and social decorum. Elizabeth admired his stability at first, the order he brought to her life after years of managing her family's affairs. But as months passed, the stillness between them grew heavy. Thomas's affection was measured, his conversations dry, and his view of marriage practical. He expected Elizabeth to host dinners, maintain appearances, and produce an heir. Love, if it existed, was buried beneath the weight of duty. She smiled for him, of course, graceful, polite. But when he wasn't looking, her eyes carried the same restrained melancholy her mother once had. Clara's marriage, on the other hand, was a storm. Samuel Bright, a local painter, was all emotion and chaos, charming when sober, cruel when drunk. His work drew attention in the local galleries, but his debts multiplied faster than his commissions. Clara had fallen for his passion, mistaking volatility for depth. Their home was filled with loud arguments, tears, reconciliations, and a kind of desperate affection that burned itself out nightly. Samuel painted her endlessly, sometimes adoringly, sometimes obsessively, as though trying to capture a version of her that kept slipping away. "She changes," he once told a friend, "like light through fog." The sisters often visited each other, each one secretly longing for what the other had. Elizabeth would sit by Clara's fire, listening to Samuel's laughter echo through the house, a sound she hadn't heard in her own for months. She envied her sister's life of feeling, even if it came with pain. Clara, meanwhile, would dine with Thomas and marvel at the calm, how he spoke gently, never raised his voice, never looked at her with disdain. She admired the order, the quiet, the sense of being safe. "You have peace," she once told Elizabeth, "and I would give anything for that." Elizabeth only replied, "Peace can be a kind of death." Clara. The contrast between their marriages widened the divide between who they were and who they wished to be. Their letters became more confessional, their visits more frequent. They began to trade advice, then confessions, and eventually fantasies. What if we had chosen differently? What if you lived my life and I yours? It was spoken in jest at first, but in the way dangerous ideas always begin, it lingered. The sisters had always mirrored one another. Now the mirror had begun to turn into a door. When Thomas noticed Elizabeth's growing distraction, he attributed it to her delicate nerves. Samuel, meanwhile, became suspicious of Clara's newfound reserve, her sudden poise, her quiet smiles that seemed borrowed from someone else. The sisters' world had begun to blur, and soon the lines between affection and envy would dissolve completely. For both Elizabeth and Clara, marriage had not only revealed who they were, but who they might become if they could trade everything they had for what they desired most. The summer of 1883 arrived with the kind of deceptive warmth that hides the rot beneath. In the village of Whitby-on-Harrow, whispers began to circulate. Whispers about the Whitby sisters and their uncanny resemblance that seemed to deepen with each passing week. Visitors often found it difficult to tell them apart now. Their hairstyles matched perfectly, their clothing indistinguishable, even their mannerisms synchronized in eerie unison. Elizabeth had taken to wearing softer colors, a habit once belonging to Clara, while Clara began dressing in the stately fashion that Elizabeth had made her signature. At gatherings, people often hesitated before addressing them, unsure which sister stood before them. It became a kind of quiet joke among neighbors, though few found it entirely amusing. But what no one outside their circle knew was that the sisters were no longer merely mirroring each other. They were rehearsing a dangerous game. It began innocently, perhaps even playfully. They would switch roles at small social visits. Clara would attend tea as Elizabeth. Elizabeth would visit the market as Clara. No one noticed. The thrill of it, the secret power of deceiving everyone around them, became intoxicating. What started as mischief turned into obsession. In their diaries, later found tucked away in an attic chest, their words mirror each other like opposing sides of a single thought. Elizabeth wrote, "She wears my face too easily." Clara wrote, "In her place I finally breathe." As their experiment deepened, so did their discontent with their own lives. Elizabeth, bound to her dull and dutiful husband Thomas, began to crave the chaos and passion she saw in Clara's world. Clara, beaten down by Samuel's temper and erratic moods, longed for Elizabeth's composure, her comfort, her calm. It was during one of their long private meetings that Elizabeth first spoke the idea aloud, a thought that would alter their fates forever. "What if," she said, "we simply changed places? Not for an afternoon, but for a time. You live as me. I live as you." Clara laughed at first, dismissing it as fantasy. But Elizabeth pressed on, convincing her with logic, with emotion, with the same quiet authority that had guided their childhood. She told Clara it would free them both, allow them to taste what they had always envied in each other's lives. No one would ever know. After all, who could tell them apart? And so, late one June evening, they sealed their pact, not with paper or promise, but with silence. They switched rings, altered their hairstyles, exchanged clothing and mannerisms. For all intents and purposes, Elizabeth became Clara, and Clara became Elizabeth. At first, the deception worked flawlessly. The husbands accepted their wives without question, perhaps too self-absorbed or too complacent to notice the subtle differences. Thomas found his wife gentler, more affectionate. Samuel found his calmer, less prone to tears. The sisters wrote to each other secretly, recording their experiences in code, reveling in the power of their own deceit. Yet beneath the thrill, something began to shift, a sense of trespass, of crossing into forbidden territory. Each began to feel not only what the other had, but what the other was. And when envy transforms into possession, the line between love and hatred begins to dissolve completely. The illusion began to fray long before either sister realized it. For months their lives had flowed like a well-rehearsed play, Elizabeth now living as Clara with the volatile Samuel, and Clara as Elizabeth, sharing quiet dinners with the reserved Thomas. But as time wore on, their letters, hidden in the false bottom of a writing desk, grew darker, more conflicted. At first they had written of wonder. Clara spoke of the strange serenity of a household without shouting, of a husband who listened, who noticed small things. Elizabeth described the feverish energy of Samuel's world, how the chaos of his art stirred something in her that had long been buried. Yet beneath their fascination, a quiet dread began to bloom. It started with a single slip. Thomas, in a rare moment of tenderness, mentioned an old memory, an incident only his true wife could have known. Clara faltered, her hesitation barely perceptible but enough to cast a shadow in his mind. Meanwhile, Samuel noticed that his wife's laughter had changed. It no longer carried the girlish tone he adored, but something measured, deliberate, almost condescending. He grew suspicious, possessive. In his drunken moods, he would stare at her across the room and mutter, "You're not her. Not anymore." The deception, once thrilling, became a trap. The sisters could not simply return to their original lives without unraveling everything. The more they tried to preserve the illusion, the deeper they sank into their own lies. Clara began to feel suffocated in the Ellery household, trapped by Thomas's routines, his gentle condescension, his dullness. She missed the passion she had fled from. Elizabeth, in turn, found herself terrified by Samuel's volatility, his jealous fits, the way he would paint for hours and then tear the canvas apart in rage. Their experiment, once meant to give them freedom, had turned into a prison built of deceit. Then came the night of the autumn fair, when everything began to crumble. Both couples attended, each wife playing her stolen role. A neighbor, slightly drunk, greeted Mrs. Ellery and remarked how well she played the piano, a skill Clara had, but Elizabeth never mastered. Thomas's eyes flickered with confusion. Later that same evening, Samuel saw his wife exchange a fleeting glance with Thomas, an expression too knowing, too intimate. The seed of suspicion was planted in both men's minds. Rumors began to circulate once again in Whitby-on-Harrow, whispers that something was not right in either household. Servants gossiped about mismatched habits, how Mrs. Ellery now prayed before bed, how Mrs. Bright had suddenly begun reading philosophy books. Friends noticed inconsistencies in stories, shifts in manner. The sisters could feel the walls closing in, the boundaries between their identities dissolving completely. They began to turn on each other, each accusing the other of carelessness, betrayal, and weakness. The love that once bound them now curdled into rivalry. In her diary, Elizabeth wrote, "She has stolen my life and refuses to give it back." Clara's response came days later. "She made me her reflection. I simply chose to live as the real thing." Their deception had ceased to be an act of shared rebellion. It had become a battle for survival, and one of them would soon have to disappear. The confrontation that ended everything began quietly, almost tenderly. It was October, the air thick with mist from the moors, the leaves slick and black underfoot. The sisters met at an abandoned cottage just outside Whitby-on-Harrow, a place they had visited as children, where they used to whisper secrets and make promises they never imagined would become deadly. That night no one saw them arrive, though a farmer later swore he heard raised voices and the sound of something heavy striking the ground. By dawn, only one sister would return home, her dress torn and her hands trembling. Elizabeth, at least the woman calling herself Elizabeth, told neighbors that her sister Clara had drowned. She claimed Clara had been distraught, overcome with guilt over past deceptions, and had vanished into the river near the edge of town. The story seemed plausible enough. Search parties found nothing but one of Clara's gloves tangled in the reeds. The coroner ruled it accidental, but unease lingered, as it always does when a story feels rehearsed. People whispered that Elizabeth appeared too composed, that her mourning was too careful, too deliberate. Then came the first of several strange discoveries. Weeks after Clara's supposed death, Elizabeth began wearing a ring, delicate gold with a sapphire stone, the same ring Clara had always worn and never removed. When questioned, she claimed her sister had given it to her before she died. But Samuel Bright, Clara's husband, saw her wearing it at a church gathering and was struck speechless. He muttered to anyone who would listen that the woman standing before them was not Elizabeth at all, but his wife. His claims were dismissed as madness, fueled by drink and grief, but even Thomas Ellery, the banker, began to watch his wife with quiet unease. In her diary, found years later, Elizabeth wrote of terrible confusion, of waking at night unsure of who she was. "I feel her hands on mine," she wrote. "Sometimes I speak in her voice. Sometimes I dream of drowning, and it is her face I see beneath the water." Whether this was guilt or delusion, no one could say. What is known is that the woman living in the Ellery home soon withdrew entirely from public life. She dismissed the servants, closed the curtains, and sent Thomas away on a business matter that would never conclude. Rumors swelled in the absence of truth. Some said Samuel had tried to confront her and vanished soon after. Others believed the sisters' deception had driven them both to madness, that perhaps Clara had not died in the river but been buried somewhere nearby. When winter came, the cottage where they last met was found burned to the ground, and in its ashes investigators discovered 2 teacups, both cracked, both containing traces of arsenic. No bodies were found. The mystery deepened as the villagers realized no one could say for certain which sister had died, or which one was left behind to play her part in the ruin that followed. Years after the supposed drowning, a peculiar silence hung over Whitby-on-Harrow. The woman known as Elizabeth Ellery had withdrawn from society. Her home shuttered, her correspondence ceased. Thomas Ellery grew frail and withdrawn himself, rarely leaving his study, muttering about a life built on mirrors. Samuel Bright had vanished entirely. His last painting, unfinished, depicting 2 faceless women in mourning black, was found abandoned in his studio. The townspeople whispered that he had gone to London, or that he had taken his own life, unable to bear the truth. But in truth, the mystery of the Whitby sisters was far from over. It had only changed shape. When the family solicitor petitioned to divide the estate a decade later, certain inconsistencies emerged. The woman living as Elizabeth had signed several legal documents using her maiden name, Clara Whitby. At first, the clerk assumed it a clerical mistake, but the signature's looping style, the flourish at the end of the W, matched Clara's handwriting precisely. That small detail drew suspicion, and soon the coroner and parish authorities reopened their records. The body buried under the name Clara Bright was ordered exhumed. On the morning of the exhumation, fog rolled through the churchyard like smoke. Villagers gathered behind the gates, huddled together as the gravediggers worked in uneasy silence. When the coffin was finally raised and pried open, what they found was not decay but revelation. The woman inside bore a scar, a long, faint mark on her shoulder, an injury Elizabeth had carried since her youth after falling from a horse. Clara had never borne such a scar. The coroner froze, pale as the mist around him. "This," he whispered, "is not Clara Bright." The finding rippled through the town like wildfire. If the body was Elizabeth's, it meant that the woman who had lived on, the one signing papers and tending the Ellery estate, was Clara herself, alive, hidden in her sister's name. But not everyone believed it. Some argued that the scar could have been misremembered, that perhaps Elizabeth had survived and orchestrated the deception to preserve her inheritance. The ambiguity only deepened the fascination, for there were details that refused to align. For instance, the handwriting on the later letters, ostensibly written by Elizabeth, bore both sisters' distinct traits, as if the writer had unconsciously merged their styles. The servants recalled hearing their mistress speaking to herself in 2 different voices. And then there was the night a neighbor saw her pacing the garden, whispering, "I buried her, but she will not rest." In the years that followed, the confusion consumed the parish records entirely. Some listed Elizabeth as deceased, others Clara. The headstones, identical placed side by side, bore only their shared surname, Whitby. The church refused to correct them, declaring the matter beyond mortal knowing. What had begun as a scandal of jealousy and deception had become something spectral, a blurring of identity so complete that even death could no longer separate the two. The truth, like the sisters themselves, was lost to the fog. By the time the truth began to surface, both sisters were gone. One buried, one vanished, and neither where she was supposed to be. Years had passed since the events that scandalized Whitby on Harrow, yet the mystery of the Whitby sisters refused to rest. It began with the discovery of a hidden will, unearthed during the sale of the old Whitby estate. The document contained instructions in Elizabeth's handwriting, or what appeared to be hers, about property rights, signed under the name Clara Bright. That single inconsistency reopened the wound that had never healed. Curiosity turned to investigation, and soon the grave that had lain untouched for over a decade was disturbed once more. The exhumation took place under gray skies, the air thick with anticipation. Villagers gathered beyond the churchyard fence, whispering prayers or curses depending on whom they believed. When the coffin was finally lifted from the soil, its contents revealed something more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The woman inside, buried as Clara Bright, bore a scar on her shoulder, the kind Elizabeth had carried since childhood, a mark from a carriage accident that had nearly killed her. The coroner, pale and trembling, confirmed it. The body was not Clara's. What followed was chaos cloaked in propriety. Officially, the records remained unchanged. The church refused to alter them. But behind closed doors, the questions multiplied. If the woman buried as Clara was truly Elizabeth, then where was the real Clara? Some believed she had assumed her sister's identity completely, living on as Elizabeth Ellery, attending church, hosting gatherings, smiling with the calmness she had once envied. Others whispered darker theories, that Clara had gone mad and taken her own life in secret, or that Samuel Bright, still haunted by his suspicions, had ended her existence and buried her somewhere beyond the moors. No evidence was ever found. Thomas Ellery, the banker who had once been Elizabeth's husband, fell into ruin shortly after the revelation. He left his position, withdrew from society, and was found years later in London, penniless and incoherent. He was said to mutter to himself, "She wears two faces," over and over until the day he died. Samuel Bright's fate was no kinder. He wasted away in prison, imprisoned for fraud and debts, painting strange, fragmented portraits of two women who looked exactly alike, but whose eyes were never the same. One pair was cold and knowing, the other frightened and alive. By the turn of the century, the Whitby estate was abandoned. Locals avoided it, claiming to hear footsteps on the upper floors and voices murmuring through the walls. The graves of the sisters still stand side by side, identical headstones marked only with the surname Whitby. Each autumn, the earth above them sags slightly, as if unsettled by something that refuses to stay buried. Even now, historians argue over which sister truly lies where, their identities forever lost to the tangled lies they spun. The legend endures because it asks an impossible question. What happens when two lives become so entwined that death itself can no longer tell them apart? In the end, Elizabeth and Clara achieved what they always desired, to be inseparable, indistinguishable, and eternal reflections of one another. Yet in that union, they erased everything that made them human. Their story lingers not as a tale of love or envy, but as a warning of what happens when the self becomes a mask, and no one remembers who wore it first. Some say the Whitby sisters never truly died, that their souls still wander between mirrors, searching for the faces they lost. But perhaps the real horror lies not in their disappearance, but in what it reveals about us. How easily love can turn to envy, how quickly identity can slip away when desire takes its place. If two sisters could trade their lives, their names, even their graves, how sure are we of who we are when no one is watching? Stories like this one remind us that the past doesn't rest, it lingers, whispering through forgotten records and fading headstones. If you felt that whisper tonight, if the mystery of Elizabeth and Clara still tugs at your thoughts, then join us. Subscribe and step deeper into the shadows of history, where truth hides behind every grave and every name tells two stories. Tell me in the comments, who do you think lies beneath the Whitby tombstone? Was it Clara who lived on, or Elizabeth who won the final deception? Your theory may hold the missing piece, and when you close this window, remember, not all secrets stay buried. Some wait for the curious, the brave, the ones who dare to keep listening. Until next time, keep your lantern lit and your eyes on the dark corners of history. because somewhere another story is waiting to be unearthed.